This is a summary of Patrick Lecture 117, which has a very long title. And the long title indicates that there are two somewhat complicated topics discussed in this lecture that relate. And the first part is shame as a yardstick for unresolved problems. The second part is seemingly favorable childhood circumstances as obstructive as hurts. So we'll take those one at a time and then put them together. Shame is a yardstick. There are two other lectures about shame. One is Patrick Lecture 31, which is about real and false shame. The other is Patrick Lecture 66, which is Shame of the Higher Self, which is an examination of childhood dynamics where we deny our nature trying to fit in with the authority structure of the family. This aspect of shame is specifically around pretense and deception, meaning that it's about where we hide our desires in an attempt to meet them. So I would hide my need for companionship by becoming an authority figure, so I could draw people to me without saying, I need you. Instead, I could say, well, I don't need you, but I will help you. I will give you service. So I'm trying to make a joke of this because I'm trying to indicate the child quality of looking for a pseudo-solution, saying, I have a need and I'm not getting it met. I'm struggling to have that need met. So I'm going to have to hide it. It gets me in trouble. But the need isn't eliminated, it's just hidden, and it will resurface. And we may come up with another way to get our need met that is not as honest or straightforward, and it isn't as satisfying either. So the guide talks about these types of solutions as pseudo-solutions or false solutions. They ease the pain in the moment, but later the need continues to erupt and cause issues, which is why the title of this section is Shame as a Yardstick for Unresolved Problems. And the guide suggests that the antidote to this kind of shame is awareness. To look for unresolved problems that could be causing this form of shame. Now I'm going to go sideways into one of the more useful techniques, tools, lectures that I have found. Patrick Lecture 127 seems to be a lecture that is understood easily by many people, so it's a very useful tool for self-examination. Patrick Lecture 127, which is called 4 Stages of Spiritual Evolution, talks about the following 4 stages. Unconscious reflex, automatic reflex, which means we don't know what's going on. Then there is awareness. Now, awareness is not an on-off switch. It's a process in itself. Automatic reflex is also a process where we have no clue and then we may have a vague sense, but a vague sense that hasn't really made it into awareness. The process of awareness is we may realize something's wrong, but we may not have enough awareness of what it is about, what it is connected to, in order to address it. For that to happen, we need to develop understanding. which is a process. And so there's a back and forth between awareness and understanding as we come into greater consciousness about what this issue is about, versus awareness of the effects and that there might be a cause, and then that we might be responsible for some of that cause. This is all about integrating understanding into awareness. And then at some point, we drop through to a knowing. Now, in the simplest form of this, at first you move your hand and milk spills, and you don't connect the two. Then you become aware that when you move your hands in a certain way and there's a glass of milk on the table, you may knock it over. You connect the sensory perception of knocking the glass with the spilling and realize that it's something you have done. But you may need another bit of time before you realize that you've not only done it, you can manage not to do it. How do you manage not to do it? Understanding. Now, I am describing what children learn relatively effortlessly and easily because they're not emotionally invested in being right or wrong. They're just trying to get through the day. So first there is an awareness that something has happened, and then an awareness that we may be partially or fully responsible for it, and then an awareness that a solution is possible, and then an understanding of cause and effect, of physics, of gravity, of dynamics, and then a knowing. And what knowing manifests, which all adults are manifesting millions of aspects of knowing, is that you wave your hand, and if there's a cup of coffee or a glass of milk on the table, you very subtly don't whack it with your hand. Now, do we whack it with our hand on occasion? Yes. But we know immediately what we've done, and we may even be able to stabilize that glass before it completely falls over. And if not, then we claim responsibility. I spilled it, I will clean it up. It doesn't turn into a huge humiliation, an issue about our competence in the world. It's a spilled glass of milk. So in using this process of delineating where we are in a certain understanding, we can use this to work with shame. So the process is to notice shame. Now, if you don't notice any shame, it may be in your automatic reflex. It may not be in full consciousness yet. Hard to work with that. Let that go. Most of us have enough little pieces of shame to work with. So that you find an aspect of shame and you bring it more fully into your consciousness and begin to look around and say, what is this about? What is it connected to? This may take a while. The other tool that we use a lot is daily review. I present it in the newsletters in the style of a written form, which is a good way to start, but it easily becomes a place where you just flip through the events of the day as you nod off at night or when you wake up in the morning. And keep track of incidents that happened that day. It is best for focusing your attention on something you want to relieve, address, understand more clearly. So you find elements of shame, and then you work on trying to notice cause and effect. What triggers them? How does that shame show up today? In this lecture, there's a 9-part process for working through finding this shame and addressing it. So that's about shame, using shame as a yardstick and understanding that it may relate to an unresolved process. The second half of the lecture is that the possibility that childhood pleasures may be as much of a problem as childhood hurts. And I relate that back to Pathwick Lecture 73, which is titled The Compulsion to Recreate and Overcome Childhood Hurts. And it talks about the dynamic where we are still unsatisfied with the frustrations that we experienced in our nuclear family of origin. And we are recreating those arguments, those dynamics, those battles with everyone we meet, from friends to employers to authority figures to mates. In this lecture, we are invited to see that recreating childhood pleasures, especially if there's a compulsion to do so, can be as damaging as trying to replay family battles, trying to resolve them in the now when they happened in history. This may not seem obvious. So the lecture talks about where pleasure can actually be quite contradictory. It's a very subjective evaluation. So in one case, an external value may be pleasurable. You may enjoy it. But it may conflict with the temporary value system. Why do I say temporary value system? The environment that we are brought up with as children is not necessarily the environment we live in today. The dynamics of our family members who have their own issues may not be similar to the general cultural issues. There are some similarities, but there are differences. So if we have attached ourselves to a value that's pleasurable, that was rejected by our parents, that was a problem in our family, we may want to recreate that pleasure as an adult. But we may want to recreate it not because we actually want the pleasure, but because it was repressed when we were a child. So we have attached to a pleasure and felt frustration, and therefore attached even more strongly to that pleasure, even though the frustration is gone. This is akin a little bit to Stockholm Syndrome. In other words, our perception of the world can become distorted by our childhood experiences. We can be a person who would ordinarily respect authority, and yet if we're in a family where authority is misused, we may become rebellious. The rebellion gives us pleasure. And as we grow up, rebellion becomes a value that we uphold despite the fact that the authority figures in our current life are benign. We can't let go of that pleasure of feeling alive and holding on to something that has value. Now, the opposite effect can also happen, and that is that we can hold on something that is actually unpleasant, but it's in alignment with the family dynamics. And this is where the context affects our evaluation of something. If I use authority as an example again, if being a good girl makes us feel loved and held and respected and honored, then we bond with authority under the position of being good and willing to obey. Then when we grow up, we're trying to recreate that pleasure of being loved and embraced and honored by honoring authority without looking at what the current authority is. So whereas being good may not feel that we're honoring ourselves, it makes us feel accepted. Later in life, we may still not be honoring ourselves, but rather trying to fit in when the larger reality is that life invites us to be more of ourselves, to come out of our shell, to embrace our individuality, which is not necessarily the environment that some of us grew up in. If this sounds complex, it is complex. This is one of those lectures where, and it actually says in the lecture, there is no formula. So this is a place where we need to look at our unique perception of what we feel shame about, track it down to the elements in our childhood that may have fostered that shame, and see where it may not be a constructive force in our life today. Now, in this process, there is described a vicious circle. And here's how that vicious circle can enact. We may, as children, hide behind the opposite of what we are. So in other words, if I admit who I am and I experience being humiliated for that, for whatever reason, but I experience humiliation for being who I am, there's a place where we do know there's a grain of truth here, where there's something important, and we may grow up and wish to claim that, but we may not be able to overcome the precise feelings of feeling humiliated for coming out as ourselves. So to gain the love, approval, and validation, we may instead try to mimic being an authority figure, the very authority that humiliated us. We may try to attain that position to protect ourselves from being humiliated. The issue here is that in that, the energetic knot in here is when we do that to avoid humiliation, we're actually not resolving the issue. We're not going back and seeing where we did misbehave and deserved to be exposed versus somebody else's desire to make fun of us, which is not appropriate, and we didn't know how to defend that when we were a child. Instead, we take on the persona of an authority figure in order to hide or mask the risk of humiliation. So there's a phrase, it's not the crime, it's the cover-up. And that's what's true here. It's not about what we did that created an atmosphere of humiliation or a pattern of humiliation. It's not being willing or able to deal with it and trying to cover it up, and therefore developing a persona, for instance, of an authority figure. Now, what happens here is that while the authority persona may function in the adult world, there's a real need for being approved of, loved, and validated, not as an authority, but as a human being that isn't met. This need does not go away. This need can become more desperate, so desperate that it acts out. And this would be a situation where you have a so-called normal adult who seems very responsible and forthright, and we can depend on this person, and then periodically they do crazy things that make no sense. There's a quality where the part of us that is real wants to be seen. It wants to burst out. And if we create too thorough a shell to hide under, then we have to break through. So the real need gets repressed, becomes desperate. It's a real need. It needs to be met. It acts out. And of course, then we have to repress it even more aggressively because we have a persona, and now we have a discrepancy between this acting out and who we feel we have to be to get what we need or to stay safe. The vicious circle keeps going round and round and round, and it creates an additional layer of resentment. Okay. The resentment for having to hide includes guilt. If we have to hide, maybe we're just bad. And if we're bad, that develops a form of shame, and that creates another layer of vicious circle. The guilt and shame and resentment do nothing to relieve the vicious circle. As a matter of fact, it can tighten it up, create an ever-increasing tighter spiral that includes resentment and a desire for revenge, which when it breaks out can be very destructive in our lives. Pathwork is about looking at acting out and saying, tracking, what brought that about? Now, if acting out involves authority figures, crimes, committing pain, it can be a very, very large event. And it is very difficult to do this kind of soul searching under crisis situations, under the stress of having to deal with financial or legal issues. So in those cases, it's very hard to do this then. The invitation is to do what you can on smaller issues and to build skills in using these ideas, these concepts, these methods, so that if and when you do feel that you are in a crisis situation, you have experience and skill at managing it as best you can, versus attempting to learn a new skill while you're under great stress. So that's an overview of this lecture. I did not do it justice. I hope that you might consider reading the lecture, Pathwork Lecture 117. There is a study guide that goes with this, and the websites for all of these are listed in the description below. So thank you very much for listening.